I drove 6 hours through a freezing snowstorm just to spend Christmas Eve with my family, only to find the house completely dark. The front door was unlocked. On the kitchen counter lay a brief, heartless note from my father. "We took your brother to Europe for the holidays. Stay here and watch your grandfather. Don't ruin our trip." I was devastated, abandoned, and forced to play caretaker to a man I barely knew. A silent, stoic grandfather my father always treated like a burden. But my father made a massive mistake. He thought he was dumping an unwanted task on me, but he had no idea who my grandfather actually was, or what was sitting inside the locked steel trunk in the basement. By the time my parents returned expecting me to be broken, the entire balance of our family had shifted forever. My name is Clara. I'm 27 years old, and if I'm being completely honest with myself, I've spent my entire adult life chasing a shadow: my father's approval. It was Christmas Eve, and a brutal blizzard was tearing through the highway, reducing visibility to nearly zero. I'd spent 6 agonizing hours behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, just to make it to my childhood home. I had wrapped presents sitting in the back seat, imagining a warm living room, the smell of roasted turkey, and finally feeling like part of the family. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was pitch black. No festive lights, no wreath on the door, no sign of life. Panic setting in, I pushed open the unlocked front door and stepped into the freezing foyer. The air inside was stale and cold. I walked into the kitchen, and that's where I saw it: a small piece of notebook paper sitting on the granite counter under a salt shaker. I picked it up, my hands trembling from the cold, and read my father's sharp, unmistakable handwriting. "Clara, we took your brother to Europe for the holidays. He deserved a real Christmas. Stay here and watch your grandfather. Keep the heat low and don't ruin our trip." My stomach dropped into a cold, heavy pit. They had left. They were in Paris or Rome, enjoying a lavish holiday, while I was dumped here like an unpaid nursemaid. Suddenly, a soft creak echoed from the living room. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting in a high-backed armchair, staring quietly into the dark, unlit fireplace, was Grandpa Arthur. I stood frozen in the doorway of the living room, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of my grandfather's chest. Grandpa Arthur was 82, and for as long as I could remember, my father had treated him like an invisible, inconvenient ghost, someone to be fed, ignored, and kept out of sight. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing down the burning humiliation of my father's note. I couldn't blame Arthur for my father's cruelty. I walked over, flipped on a floor lamp, and knelt by his chair. "Grandpa," I whispered gently, "it's Clara. I'm going to turn up the thermostat and make us some dinner, okay?" Arthur slowly turned his head. His eyes, usually clouded and distant whenever my father was around, were suddenly sharp, clear, and strikingly intense. He looked at me for a long moment, taking in my snow-drenched coat and weary expression. "They left you behind, didn't they, Clara?" His voice rasped, steady and surprisingly strong. I blinked, caught off guard. Yeah. They went to Europe." Arthur let out a low, dry chuckle that held no humor. Classic Richard. Always running off with what isn't his, leaving others to clean up the mess. I sat back on my heels, stunned. My father had spent years convincing everyone that Arthur's mind was slipping, that he was barely lucid. But the man sitting in front of me was entirely present. "You're an accountant now, aren't you?" Arthur asked, his gaze locked onto mine. "Working in forensic auditing in the city? How did you know that?" I gasped. My father never talked about my job. He always dismissed it as unimportant compared to my brother's career. Arthur leaned forward, resting his liver-spotted hands on his knees. "I know a lot of things, Clara. And starting tomorrow, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about who actually owns this house, and where your father's business money really came from." The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a silent blanket of snow outside, but inside the atmosphere had completely shifted. Over a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, Arthur didn't look or act like a helpless old man. His posture was straight, his eyes focused. "Clara," he said, setting his cup down, "reach into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat in the hall. Bring me what's inside." I walked to the closet, found his vintage brown overcoat, and reached into the hidden lining. My fingers wrapped around a cold, heavy iron key attached to a brass tag. I brought it back and set it on the table. Arthur picked it up, running his thumb over the metal. Your father built a heavy steel door in the basement 5 years ago. He told everyone it was for security, but the truth is he was trying to lock me out of my own past. He thinks I forgot about this key. He thinks I'm too weak to walk down those stairs. My heart hammered against my ribs. Growing up, that basement door was strictly off-limits. My father always claimed it held old, dangerous power tools and corporate records. I offered Arthur my arm, and together we descended the wooden stairs into the dim, chilly basement. We stood before the reinforced metal door. Arthur handed me the key. I inserted it into the heavy deadbolt, turned it, and felt a deep click echo through the foundation. I pushed the door open. Inside was a small, climate-controlled room. In the center sat a massive olive-green military steel trunk with heavy brass latches. "Open it," Arthur instructed quietly. I popped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside lay neatly arranged rows of medals, framed high-level intelligence clearances, photo albums, and thick leather-bound ledgers. Arthur hadn't just been a quiet businessman. He was a decorated military intelligence strategist who held top-tier security clearances for decades. But resting on top of the military files was a sealed manila envelope labeled Property Deeds and Original Trust. "Read the first page," Arthur said softly. I opened the document and scanned the legal text. My breath caught in my throat. My father hadn't bought this estate or built his company from scratch. Arthur owned every single square foot of the land, and the entire house was legally registered under a revocable family trust, one that my father had been quietly trying to usurp. I pulled the legal documents out of the envelope, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the yellowing pages. As a forensic auditor, I knew how to read between the lines of financial paperwork, but what I was looking at made my stomach churn. "Look at the second clause," Arthur directed, his voice steady and sharp. I scanned down the page. 30 years ago, when my grandfather retired, he had set up an irrevocable trust meant to fund higher education, property purchases, and career development for his grandchildren. A trust designed specifically for me and my future. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been deposited into an account bearing my name. Or at least it was supposed to be in my name. I turned to the recent bank statements attached at the back. 5 years ago, my father had filed fraudulent paperwork, claiming Arthur was mentally incapacitated. He had taken sole control of the trust, quietly draining nearly $400,000. He hadn't used it for my education. I was still paying off my own student loans. He had used my inheritance to bankroll my brother's luxury lifestyle, high-end cars, and overseas trips, while using the rest to prop up his failing logistics business. "He kept me isolated in this house so I couldn't tell you," Arthur said, placing a gentle, weathered hand on my shoulder. "And he treated you like an afterthought so you'd never think to ask about the family finances. He divided us to keep us blind." Tears of rage stung my eyes. All those years of feeling inadequate, of begging for my father's pride, while he was actively stealing my future. Arthur looked me dead in the eye. "Shall we fix this, Clara?" "Yes," I whispered. Over the next 3 days we didn't waste a single second. Arthur contacted his personal estate attorney, a high-powered lawyer my father thought had retired years ago. Together we compiled forensic bank audits, property records, and power of attorney revocation forms, building an airtight legal trap. On New Year's Eve, the quiet peace we had built over the past week was violently shattered. A flurry of bitter cold air rushed through the hallway as the front door swung wide open, slamming hard against the wall. Heavy footsteps and loud, irritated voices echoed through the foyer. My father, mother, and golden child brother had returned early, their lavish European holiday cut short by sudden flight cancellations. My father stomped into the kitchen, his face flushed with winter chill and absolute annoyance, dragging 3 heavy designer suitcases behind him. He took one look at the kitchen, completely bare of any welcome home feast, and his eyes narrowed into furious slits. "Clara," he barked, dropping his bags with a deafening thud. "Are you kidding me? The house is freezing, there's no food ready, and where is the old man? Why isn't he locked away upstairs like I told you?" He stood there, expecting me to shrink back, to apologize, to scramble like a terrified servant trying to appease his sudden wrath. He expected a broken, exhausted daughter who had suffered through a miserable, lonely week. Instead, I didn't move an inch. I calmly walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room, pulling out a chair right next to Grandpa Arthur, who sat upright and composed at the head of the table. Between us sat a thick, pristine legal folder stamped with the official seal of Arthur's estate attorney. My father froze halfway across the room, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. My mother and brother crowded behind him, staring at us as if we had lost our minds. "Take off your coats, Richard," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the silence like cold steel. "Shall we begin?" My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous red. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, taking 2 aggressive steps toward the table. "Claire, what did you do? Did you break into the basement? You have no right to meddle in things you don't understand." He reached out to snatch the folder, but Arthur slammed his hand onto the wood. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "Sit down, Richard," Arthur commanded, his eyes flashing with the cold authority of a decorated military officer. For the first time in his life, my father flinched. He slowly backed down, sinking into a chair, stunned into silence. My mother and brother stood frozen near the entryway. I opened the thick folder and pulled out the top document. "Let's talk about the $400,000 you stole from my trust fund over the last 5 years, Dad," I said, keeping my voice completely level. My father went pale, his jaw tightening. "That was business money. That was my inheritance, illegally diverted through forged signatures while you falsely claimed Grandpa was incompetent," I interrupted, sliding the forensic audit across the table. "And let's talk about this house. You don't own it. Grandpa does. You've been breaching the family trust agreement for over a decade. You can't prove any of this," my father stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the papers. Arthur leaned forward. "My attorney has already filed the power of attorney revocation forms with the state court. The bank accounts are frozen. Here are your options, Richard. Sign over the diverted assets, return control of the primary estate, and repay every cent stolen from Clara's trust, or face immediate formal legal prosecution and public disclosure of your fraud by tomorrow morning." My father stared at the legal document sitting on the dining table, his hands shaking as the reality of his situation set in. He looked at Arthur, then at me, searching for any sign of hesitation or weakness. He found none. Surrounded by the irrefutable paper trail of his own financial betrayal, his arrogant posture completely collapsed. Without a word, he picked up the pen, signed the transfer documents, and quietly surrendered control of the estate. True to his word, Grandpa Arthur immediately restructured the family trust, transferring the house and my full restored inheritance directly into my name. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my father's permission or approval to exist. I was financially secure, independent, and completely free. My parents and brother left a few days later, unable to face the quiet authority that now governed the house. I stayed behind with Arthur to help him organize his affairs and settle into a life where he was no longer treated like an invisible burden. Looking back, driving through that freezing blizzard on Christmas Eve felt like the worst night of my life. I thought I was being abandoned and forced to endure a lonely, miserable week. But that single week changed everything. Being left behind turned out to be the greatest gift I ever received. It brought me back to the grandfather who saved my future and helped me finally discover who I truly was.